There are many ways to characterize the different phases of the psychoanalytic or the psychotherapeutic process. Freud tended to distinguish an opening phase, a middle phase that he called working through, and then an ending phase. It's possible to divide the process up into many different phases and subphases. But at the risk of being oversimplifying, I've been impressed lately with the idea of distinguishing two fundamentally different stages of the analytic process. And for some reason, at this late stage in my career, this seems to be coming a little clearer to me lately. Roughly speaking, we could characterize the two stages as PS and D. PS for paranoid schizoid position, and D for the so-called depressive, I prefer to say reparative position. In Melanie Klein's thinking, two fundamentally different organizations of psychic life. PS being primitive, schizoid meaning everything is split, there's no ambivalence, it's all good, all bad. Others are all good or all bad. The self is all good or all bad. There is no integrated self. There is an all good self and an all bad self, an all good object, an all bad object. Splitting prevails, and then, of course, projection leading to paranoia. The good object can be projected out and the bad object kept within, or the other way around. The bad object projected out, good object kept in. Same with self states. So paranoid schizoid position, a position characterized by splitting and projection and paranoia, paranoid anxiety, persecutory anxiety, feeling hunted and attacked and persecuted by the bad object. One can identify with the bad object and attack and attempt to persecute others. So this is a pretty scary world of kill or be killed, eat or be eaten, organized along sadomasochistic lines. You're either the sadist who's doing the attacking or the masochist who's being beaten. And of course, these roles can flip around, which is why Freud hyphenated the term sadomasochism. So this is a primitive world. The leading emotion in many ways is persecutory anxiety. And of course, it's because they've been living to a greater or a lesser extent in this world that patients seek out therapy. They're in trouble. They're unhappy. They are feeling persecuted by others, or they're busy persecuting themselves. Millions of ways to persecute oneself. One can sabotage oneself. One can limit oneself. One can get oneself into relationships where one will be attacked, put down, persecuted. One can be constantly attacking oneself, the persecutory superego, flogging me, telling me how inadequate I am, how inferior I am. I fill myself with states of shame, painful states of shame and self-consciousness, persecutory guilt, and so on. So people in this position are feeling unhappy. rather tortured, tormented, persecuted, and so they seek out analysis. The PS position is characterized by fantasy. For Melanie Klein, the mind is a fantasy system. But she spelled fantasy PH instead of F to distinguish conscious fantasy, as in daydreams, F fantasy, as opposed to PH fantasy, which is unconscious fantasy. So what is an unconscious fantasy? It's a fantasy that we do not realize is a fantasy. It's a fantasy that we mistake for reality. And that's pretty close to what we mean by delusion. For many years, we tended to think of delusions as characterizing psychosis. Only psychotic people were delusional. Some decades ago, Schizoid came out with a book called Delusions of Everyday Life. And increasingly, we've come to realize, of course, that everyone is delusional to some extent. I mean, the back pages of every newspaper in the world seems to be filled with astrology columns and advice, and all of which is delusional, of course. Apparently, many people still are delusional about the reality of anthropogenic climate change. Delusions are not hard to find, but especially among people who inhabit the paranoid schizoid position. And this is delusional thinking that is not recognized as delusional. People are captured by their fantasies, by their belief systems, by their ideologies, and they are mistaking fantasy for fact. One can say they are captured by delusions and by illusions. One can say that to one degree or another, they are out of touch with reality. Now, I believe this is true of all people to some degree, but relatively sane people are captured less by fantasy and ideology than others are. As we move out of PS into the depressive reparative position, reality testing is enhanced. We acquire the capacity to become self-critical. We acquire a capacity for self-doubt. We acquire a capacity to tolerate uncertainty. That famous statement by John Keats in a letter to his brother about negative capability, which is the capacity to sit in mysteries, to sit in uncertainty without reaching out irritably for closure, for certainty, to be able to bear doubt and uncertainty. That is a pretty good measure of mental health. The more a person can tolerate not knowing and waiting in uncertainty until things begin to clarify. The ability to doubt oneself, call oneself into question. This is a measure of relative, I don't like the term mental health, that medical model. Let's call it maturity, psychological maturity, emotional maturity. So emotional maturity has something to do with suspicion, being suspicious of oneself. One doesn't want to entirely trust oneself because emotional maturity means that one has learned that oneself is not entirely trustworthy. One comes to know oneself. And one comes to know that one tends to fall into illusions and even into delusions at times. Uh, we become acquainted with the fact that we tend to lose it a little bit from time to time. And we come to know, certainly if we've been in analysis for a number of years, we come to know about the kinds of situations that are likely to cause us to fall into illusions and delusions. These are our danger situations. We're vulnerable in certain ways that we learn about through painful experience. So we have a somewhat suspicious attitude towards ourselves. Okay, back to the idea of two main phases of psychoanalytic work. And of course, this is a gross oversimplification. We could break all of these down into subphases, and it would be useful to do so. But for my purposes now, a person comes into therapy because they're feeling persecuted. They don't know why. Now, initially, they're going to be testing the analyst. Who is this person? Is this person trustworthy? Can I be comfortable with this person? Is this a person of integrity and honesty? And can he or she be trusted? Of course, all of that's going on in the early sessions. But if it seems that the two parties click and can trust one another and begin to find ways of working together, talking together, communicating together, then the work can begin. And in this first phase, I'm inclined to characterize the work as being work in which the analyst, coming to know the patient's way of looking at things, begins to notice distinctive patterns or ways of thinking, begins to notice certain rigidities. In certain areas, the patient seems very certain, and yet the analyst finds himself wondering whether the patient has a right to feel so certain, or is the patient justified to be so certain about certain things? Patient is busy painting pictures of his life and of the people in his life, and one begins to wonder, the analyst begins to wonder, how accurate are these pictures? And of course, over time, we have the development of a transference, which means that the patient is beginning to paint certain pictures of the analyst and is painting certain pictures of the way the analyst and the patient are together, or what has happened between them. Patient has ways of interpreting not only the people in his life outside the analysis, but he begins to interpret the analyst. He reports that he thought the analyst said such and such. He has the idea the analyst feels and believes such and such. And the analyst is wondering, well, where did the patient get that idea? Did I indicate that I believe that? Did I say I believe that? What makes the patient so sure I feel what he is saying I'm feeling? Okay, we're calling the patient's pictures into question. I mean, we're not throwing a bucket of cold water on the patient and saying, wake up, you're delusional. No. It's a cooperative enterprise. The analyst has to be open to the fact that sometimes the pictures he's painting are distorted, and should be open to having the patient help him with his distortions. What goes on between two people is incredibly complex. Sometimes the analyst will be off. Hopefully the patient will help correct the analyst when he's off. But the focus is mainly on the patient. We're not engaged in mutual analysis here. The analyst has already spent a considerable number of years in analysis and ideally ought to know himself reasonably well, which doesn't preclude him falling into illusions and delusions and simple outright mistakes, of course. But the attention is mainly on the patient. This is an examination of the patient's mind. This is an examination, a mutual examination of the patient's fantasies, beliefs, assumptions. People have many, many background assumptions. And some of these assumptions just aren't valid. Patients assume certain things to be true, and often they're not very true. And so patient has painted a particular picture of his wife. And then he comes into a session and quotes the wife extensively and describes what she's been saying, and the analyst noticed this doesn't fit the picture that has been painted so far of the wife. By the way, it's a great error on the part of analysts to assume that the pictures that they are getting about the spouse or the mother or the father are accurate. It's a grave error on the part of the analyst to excessively buy into the patient's depictions of the people in his life. These are often highly distorted, and from a strictly legal point of view, everything the analyst gets is mere hearsay. The analyst has never met these people. He has no way at all to know to what degree what the patient is saying is, to what degree is it objective. The analyst has no objective standard. So he mustn't fall into thinking that he's in a position to objectively diagnose the spouse or the parents. He may form certain ideas, but he should hold these ideas very tentatively because they're probably quite distorted. And anyway, he can't know. So the analyst is trying to exercise negative capability. He's trying to sit in mysteries. He's trying to not engage in closure or certainty. His job is to call things into question. Now, I don't mean this should be carried to such a radical extent as in certain postmodern traditions where there simply is no truth. That's not at all what I'm saying. I believe that truth exists. I believe it's important to look for it. In calling all of these fantasies into question, we're trying to grope towards a more accurate apprehension of truth, which exists. But it's very hard to find. It's very hard to get to. And certainly our only hope of getting to it is through the deconstruction of the fantasies that we mistake for it. So this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to open up the possibility of getting a closer approximation to an ultimately incompletely knowable truth. We're trying to get to a closer approximation of truth by calling a whole series of untruths, fantasies mistaken for truth. We're trying to call these into question and in this way open up some possibility. Okay, so this is the first phase of the analysis. All of this suspicion, all of this calling things into question. At a certain point in the work, when a significant number of the patient's core fantasies, core illusions, core delusions, when these have been deconstructed, the patient has seen through these things. The patient is waking up to a considerable degree. Things that he used to take for granted, he is not taking for granted anymore. He finds himself in situations which stimulate an old belief system, an old set of conclusions, and this time he's not embracing these old conclusions, these old beliefs. He sees that he's tempted to, but these have been analyzed. He sees that they're often not accurate. He's holding them in abeyance. He's not automatically buying them the way he used to. He's got a bit of distance now, and now he has some time to look around and maybe see something new. Maybe see something that was occluded or foreclosed by the old fantasies when they were so taken for granted. So increasingly, surprise is becoming possible. The glimpsing of something new, something unpredictable, something that is out of sync with the old fantasy system. He's starting to realize how much he had oversimplified a whole series of things. He's not oversimplifying so much. He's coming into the now. He's coming into the present. For much of his life, he has projected these old fantasies and beliefs onto every new situation, thereby screening out what is new and different. Forcing the present into the past, imposing the past on the present, and thereby not even really glimpsing large elements of present reality. And so this is beginning to shift. And the patient is becoming freer, because he's now noticing that he's free to construe situations differently. He doesn't have to go with the automatic construals of the past. He sees possibilities to reconstrue, reconfigure. So it doesn't have to be seen that way. Here's another way of looking at it. And so his eyes are opening. He's becoming freer. And an important part of this is he becomes now capable of thinking. There was very little thinking in the past. He was something of an automaton. He had his programming, the programs being the fantasies, the beliefs. He kept imposing them on every new situation, making it not new, but old. There was very little thinking involved, very little room for thinking, but now he's not reacting so automatically now. And it's as if now he has time to think. I could construe it in the old way, but maybe I could construe it differently. Let me take a good close look at this. Let me take my time. Let me not jump to conclusions. Maybe this is different. Maybe now I can do something different instead of the old automatic reaction patterns. Maybe I have an opportunity. Okay, this is a person who is changing. This is a big part of what change in psychoanalysis is all about. The freedom to begin to think, to not impose old conclusions on new situations, to be able to pause and ponder, and sometimes even be surprised. And in this way, one begins to change. Okay.